way we Wallace led, Scots from Bruce has often led. Welcome to your gory bed, on to victory. Knows the day and knows the hour, see the front of battle, see approach proud Edward's power, chains and slavery. Oh, will be a traitor knave, oh, will fill a cow's grave, oh, say base as be a slave, let him turn and flee. Oh, for Scotland's king and law, freedom's sword was strongly drawn, freeman standeth, freeman fall.
Welcome to the Rosenbach Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ames, Director of Outreach and Engagement at the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. This is Season 4, celebrating the Rosenbach's treasures, in which I take you behind the scenes into the Rosenbach's exciting new gallery exhibition project, Treasures from the Rosenbach's Collection. We will engage in conversations about the global connections of our remarkable rare books, manuscripts, and artifacts. In this episode, I will speak with Rosenbach member and Drexel University professor Sheila Sandapen about Black British literature and the post-colonial British experience. When you step into the Rosenbach's brand new permanent exhibition titled Treasures from the Rosenbach's Collection, Literature of Great Britain and Ireland, you are greeted by two portraits of important literary figures whose books sit on the Rosenbach's shelves, Phillis Wheatley and Ignatius Sancho. Both people of African descent, the lives of these authors were shaped by European and specifically British colonialism. Phillis Wheatley was born in West Africa around 1754 and was forcibly brought to colonial Boston, Massachusetts when she was only 7. She was enslaved by the Wheatley family for domestic work. Phillis learned English, Latin, and possibly Greek. Her early promise in composing poetry led to her first publication in the Newport Mercury newspaper in 1767. Unable to publish a book in the American colonies, she traveled to London in 1773, where she met the Countess of Huntingdon, who assisted in publishing her volume of poems, the first by an African-American woman. A copy of that book resides in the Rosenbach collection. Ignatius Sancho was born while crossing the Atlantic Ocean on a vessel carrying captive Africans to Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere, where they were sold and enslaved. Sancho was orphaned when he was only 2 years old. The man who enslaved the toddler in the colony of New Granada took Sancho to England and gave him to a family who lived in Greenwich. In an unlikely turn of events, Sancho befriended the second Duke of Montague and escaped captivity. The Montagues provided him a job as a butler and opportunities to explore the arts, literature, and learning. Sancho became well known in London society. He opened a grocery store that granted him and his family financial stability and allowed Sancho to engage widely in the artistic and cultural scene. As a property holder, Sancho was the first person of African descent known to have qualified to vote in parliamentary elections in Great Britain. The Rosenbach owns a copy of Sancho's letters, which was published after his death. These stories remind us that the heights of British Political, economic, and cultural influence in the 18th and early 19th centuries were deeply influenced by colonialism and enslavement. Artifacts in the collection of the Rosenbach document this complex heritage. When you visit our new permanent exhibition, Treasures from the Rosenbach's Collection, Literature of Great Britain and Ireland, you will come face to face with Sancho, Wheatley, and the broader legacy of Britain's colonial and imperial past. I am intrigued to learn more about the world of Black British literature and how contemporary authors are responding to the legacies of colonialism and imperialism that continue to shape our world. Fortunately for me, a member of the Rosenbach community whom I've gotten to know over the years is an expert in this field and has agreed to join me for today's conversation. Sheila Sandapen is Director of English Programs and Teaching Professor in the Department of English and Philosophy at Drexel University here in Philadelphia. She holds a PhD in Literature and Criticism from Indiana University of Pennsylvania and studies the connections between literature, culture, race, ethnicity, gender, and the British experience. Sheila, thank you so much for your support of the Rosenbach and for joining me on the Rosenbach Podcast.
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for having me.
Before we dive into our specific subject of focus for the day, tell me a little bit more about yourself, your scholarly and your literary interests, and what inspired your interest in Black British fiction.
Well, in some cases, it's very personal. Black British literature is the story of the British Empire and colonialism, and I'm very much a product of colonialism. My great-grandparents were Indian, but moved to the British-owned colony of Mauritius, which is an island in the Indian Ocean, south of India and east of Madagascar. As a result, when my parents and grandparents were born in Mauritius, they were actually considered British citizens. Both my grandfathers fought for the British Army during World War II. As a young man, my father came to London, where he ended up meeting my mother. They married and decided to stay in England. I was born in London and educated there. It wasn't until years later, after my family moved to the States, and I returned to studying British literature for my graduate work, that I understood how the canon of British literature had expanded. In 2004, Bruce King authored the volume, The Oxford English Literary History, 1948 to 2000. And in this book, he not only included authors who were of Indian and African descent, but he went on to talk a little bit about how these citizens of the United Kingdom, whether they were immigrants or their children who had actually been born on British soil, had gone ahead and contributed to literature in such a way that it had sort of revitalized English literature, which he claimed had become in danger of becoming stagnant. And then he went ahead and called this English. This literature is English, which becomes very important, the distinction between being English and being British.
Can you say more about that? Why was it so important to him that it specifically be referred to as English?
Traditionally, when someone is referred to as British, it simply means, oh, you hold a British passport or you have British citizenship. Being English meant something more akin to, oh, you are of Anglo-Saxon descent. You are the true heir to England. This really influences attitudes, I think, in terms of how people are perceived. So, for example, years ago, I had a family friend tell me that I could be British, but I could not call myself English.
That's so interesting. And you're speaking to someone today who grew up in one region of the United States, now lives in another, but pretty monocultural. And I'm wondering if in your life journey, I mean, you have this global heritage. Do you yourself feel British? Do you feel English? How do you sort of connect to that broader heritage? And would you say that the literature, your focus on literary studies has helped you figure out how you fit within this larger set of cultural processes?
Absolutely. I don't know as a younger person that I paid too much mind to it. You're just busy doing. But in reading the literature and going back and sort of learning the history, which was not something that we were being taught in school at the time, has been so eye-opening and has really sort of helped me in some ways make connections with my family, because I was then able to sort of go, for example, to my father and say, oh my goodness, I've just learned about Enoch Powell. What was that like to live during his campaign and actually sort of hear a firsthand account? And for those of us who may not be familiar, Enoch Powell was a politician in the 60s who was very concerned with immigration, especially immigration of people who were not white coming into the United Kingdom. And he gave this infamous speech that talked about the rivers of blood, the fact that the English identity was about to be diluted by mixing with non-white identity. It was very heated rhetoric, and it gave rise to some quite unfortunate is an understatement, some blatant racist, horrible actions against people who thought they were British but weren't being treated as British.
One thing that I noted in learning more about your research and scholarly interests is that you emphasize not only the sort of geographic component of colonialism and imperialism, but in the authors you study, you focus on gender as well. Can you explain how in the literature you study, race, colonialism, imperialism, and gender intertwine?
First off, there was a tradition of Black British literature that was being established as early as the 40s and 50s, but they were primarily male. These were men who were coming from the Caribbean, who were settling into London, maybe even being educated at Oxford, at Cambridge, had connections, were being published, sort of telling their story. And myopically, there was this idea that women had nothing to offer, and that anything that they would say would just be a mere echo of the male story, which is really odd to me. But not when you think about postcolonial studies, not something that is unusual. It's usually the women are urged to take a back seat while the men are doing the planning and the working. And the idea is, well, when things get better in the future, then you'll have a voice. Also, I became really interested in the idea of the barriers women face, in the sense that they may live in homes that have cultural values that are different from the greater homogeneous society. And so the outside is looking upon the women as being poor or oppressed or limited. And the families that they're in are sort of putting pressure on them to be more like a traditional person. And then you've got the actual person in the middle who's trying to wield both of those identities, trying to understand, who am I? How do I stand? I'm neither from the old country, but I'm not fully from the country I was born in. What is my new identity? So that was one of the things that I was very much interested in. And as I said, this story wasn't really being told because women didn't have a way to get their work published. And in 1978, the Women's Press was founded, and this was sort of the opportunity for this feminist press, was this opportunity for women to sort of get their stories out. And that really started a rich tradition, I think, in terms of women being able to sort of speak to their unique experiences in a way that was fresh and interesting, and not just being dismissed as, oh, we've heard this story before.
Thanks so much for all of that background and sort of establishing the framework in which we will have our conversation about some of the issues that we've already discussed, as well as specific titles and authors. For our American listeners, help us understand how contemporary U.S. culture's responses to the legacies of racism and enslavement compare to the state of the cultural debate around these same issues in the United Kingdom. In what ways are the cultural conversations happening in both nations similar, and in what ways do they differ?
Yes. So this is a very complex question, but the short answer is in the United States, there was an established system for slavery that kept generations of a certain population in the column of property, and they were not considered citizens of the United States. This is the legacy that is still playing out today in terms of who gets to vote, who gets to have certain jobs, who gets to share part of the American pie. In England, and England certainly benefited from slavery in its colonies, there was no mass enslavement on its shores. That doesn't mean there weren't slaves in England, but it means that there is a comfortable fiction, perhaps is the right term, of, well, we didn't enslave people on our shores. We were we were a little bit more humane. There was a growing abolition movement in England, and in 1834, Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act that outlawed the owning, buying, and selling of humans as property throughout its colonies. However, that doesn't mean the law was enforced or that there were no slaves in England. Oftentimes, while there was no legal basis for slavery in England, Black people who were brought to England as slaves, they were slaves overseas and they were brought to England, they could be turned into indentured servants who worked as domestics for no pay. However, at the same time, there were Black people in the United Kingdom who were not enslaved. Some were paid domestics, others were tradesmen, musicians, or businessmen. So there was this sort of genteel fiction that was going on in that there were some Black people around. Not all of them were enslaved. There doesn't need to be a national guilt when it comes to thinking of the treatment of Black people on British soils. So famously, Ignatius Sancho was brought to England as a slave, ended up running away from his masters who weren't very good people, entered the Duke of Montague's house where he ended up serving as a butler and then a valet, which were really high-standing positions within the household. With the support of the Montague family, by 1774, Sancho was able to live independently, opened a grocer's in England and sold products such as tea, which was a product of slavery. As a man who had property, Sancho was qualified to vote, which actually makes him the first Black person in England to vote. In the last 20 years, England and especially Scotland have made an effort to update existing museum exhibits and landmarks to acknowledge the contributions of its many Black citizens who lived in England both as slaves and as free men.
Thanks for providing some of that context. And I just think it's such an important and fascinating conversation to have because I've been to the UK now 3 times since 2019 on various business trips, and the similarities in terms of the cultural discourses are very evident. And yet they're tinctured differently in precisely the way that you're describing sort of the perspective that the societies have on these issues. So it's really helpful to get a little bit of that scholarly perspective. So for those listeners who are interested in reading more deeply in the area of Black British literature, who are some of the historical authors of the past few hundred years whom they might want to explore?
Well, I mean, a good place to start with would actually be the letters of Ignatius Sancho. There is the autobiography of Mary Prince that kind of details her experiences living in England. Mary Seacole was a nurse actually who was fighting in the Crimean War and was was actually contemporary of Florence Nightingale. Ended up dying in poverty because she did not gain the same recognition by the government when she returned back to England. So she has written an autobiography detailing her time in the Crimea, which I think would be really a wonderful place to start. Sam Selvon's The Lonely Londoners is another really great seminal work that I think sort of really captures that integration of British citizens and Black people coming together post-World War II.
And listeners should know that we at the Rosenbach hold an important early edition of the Letters of Ignatius Sancho, which you will likely see on exhibition in our Treasures Gallery, or can request to see on a research appointment if that's a title of particular interest. So bearing those historical titles in mind, who are some contemporary authors who are exploring themes of race, identity, and imperial legacies in British life? I'm hoping that you can help us assemble a reading list of some of the authors of recent times and those working today whom we may wish to explore.
Absolutely. And this list is a little bit broader. For a very brief time in the 70s, Black British fiction meant both people of Asian descent and of African descent. And part of that was a political move to sort of garner more support in terms of protesting. And so this list is going to reflect that a little bit, like both those experiences. So first off, I would have to mention Small Island by Andrea Levy. This book centers on the 1948 Windrush, which was the ship that brought men from the Caribbean to England in 1948 to help work because England had lost so many men in World War II. Interestingly enough, Levy is on record as saying that she had not realized that her own parents had been a product of Windrush. They never really spoke about it. So in writing this book, she was sort of uncovering her own personal history. Brick Lane by Monica Ali, Anita and I by Mira Sial. Highly recommend Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, who won the Booker Prize with this book back in 2019. It's a wonderful, wonderful book on the variance of being Black, being woman, being British. There are the books by Alex Wheatley. Also, I would check out contemporary authors Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendez, In the Palace of Flowers by Victoria Princewell, Poor by Caleb Fermi. And I would also pitch for a couple of, for a TV show actually called We Are Lady Parts, and a film that came out last year called Polite Society, which were both written and directed by Nida Manzoor, and really treats and really talks about what it's like to be Muslim and British and woman and still be unique and not be some sort of stereotypical person that someone might assume.
I am curious to hear how your students at Drexel respond to the various themes that we've been discussing today. I know you teach in these areas as well. And do students come into your courses familiar with a lot of these genres and authors and approaches to looking at British literature? Or do you find that you're sort of pushing students to think in new ways about what seems like a very traditional topic?
That's a wonderful question. Yes, this is not something that the students really know anything about. In fact, sometimes compiling the book list can be difficult because the bookstore won't have access to these books, and so I'm usually buying books for the students or telling them to go to the big mall in the sky. And what I have, and this is what I've been saying all along is representation is so important. I have Black African American students who come into class and I have to be very, upfront right at the start and say, I'm going to use the term Black because not all people of African descent who don't live in the United States can be called African American.
Right.
I mean, right there, that's a small thing, but it's something that they've, heard this label all along, and it's unfathomable to them that it doesn't apply to the rest of the world. And I've had, African American students tell me that they hadn't realized the struggle that Black people have in other nations. Like they thought it was uniquely an African American struggle. And as you pointed out earlier, it is a nuance. It's slightly different and it's slightly framed differently, but it means, I think it means something to them that there's a wider picture. For my students of Indian descent, they've never really heard these authors either, and they're always so amazed by the fact that they're finally seeing the issues that they're familiar with being represented in books, and they become so passionate and so interested in sort of consuming the books and the films. There was a series of films by Steve McQueen, who is a Black film director, that had been running on Amazon, I believe, Amazon Prime, and it talked a lot about the Brixton riots from the 1970s and the legacy of the Caribbean. And they were completely fascinated because they hadn't seen anything like this before.
Mm-hmm.
So it does make a difference. I don't teach it as often, but I sometimes like to sneak books in, especially if I'm talking about British literature. When we're talking about contemporary British literature, I want them to see the full gamut. And the couple of times that I've taught Girl, Woman, Other, the students have loved it and couldn't believe that they'd never heard of this book. And I've even had students who've said, well, I'm going to forward this book to a friend of mine. They should read it.
Wow.
So yes, I think there's definitely a need or an interest when students finally connect.
Yeah, and something that we have found works well with the book clubs that we run at the Rosenbach is we do 3-month seasons of each book club, and the first session is always sort of a canonical text, maybe a really famous book that falls into a more traditional category, but then we follow up with sort of responses to that text from other authors, other traditions, maybe a little bit more from the margins. And I would expect that as you are assembling course syllabi, you might have a little bit of that same strategy or that same necessity of, if you're teaching a course on 19th century British literature, you might need to make sure that, Jane Austen or the Bronte sisters are there, but then how do you put that text in conversation with other perspectives?
Absolutely. I think that is so important, especially today, because we do live in a global world and it's important to understand how we're connected. And so I'm a huge fan of Jane Austen. And probably about 2 years ago, Chawton House, the cottage where Austen lived and wrote some of her books, sort of got into trouble because they started exploring the Austen's family's connections to slavery. And her fans felt that it was a way to besmirch her memory. And that's not what was happening at all. It was sort of like, look, there's this bigger picture. She lived in this world. Let's explore these connections. And it was just the conversation that was occurring around that was very fascinating, how much we resist wanting to know other sides of the story.
Well, as we've been talking about these issues, my mind keeps going back to Ignatius Sancho, whom we discussed, and also Phillis Wheatley, and just thinking about how these 18th, early 19th century stories, defy the national categorizations that, of course, we use today and reflect the fluidity of the world that they lived in, figuratively and literally. I mean, both of them became published authors because of access to the imperial center from the imperial margins. And I think that I'm so glad that we have both Wheatley and Sancho in our collection because they serve as this sort of reminder of the global nature of enslavement, of author networks, of publishing, of the economy, of politics in that early period.
Absolutely. And you and I have talked a little bit about Phillis Wheatley, and you reminded me that she came to England to get published,
Right.
and sort of had a book tour and was somewhat treated with, a little bit of celebrity, whereas in the United States, people questioned whether she really was capable of authoring her text.
Yeah, and an interesting, I guess, sort of museological side note from our work and interpretation at the Rosenbach is that we own both a British first edition of Phillis Wheatley's poems and the American first edition, which post-dated the British first edition, of course. And the British first edition is the more famous of the two visually because that's the edition that has the iconic frontispiece engraved portrait of Wheatley presented in a very dignified fashion as an author. The American first edition did not have that portrait. And so, again, we see the importance of that sort of global context in sort of how we discuss these authors and how we present them to our broader communities. So you and I met on one of the Rosenbach's Behind the Bookcase tours, focused on the history and culture of tea in this larger early modern imperial context. And that's where we cooked up the idea for this podcast episode. And I'm wondering, just to sort of zoom out for a minute from the specific topic of our discussion today, can you reflect for me about what role you think collecting institutions, educational institutions like the Rosenbach, do play in our modern society and should play in an era when there's a lot of questions about the place of the humanities in education. Obviously, our civic environment is very polarized and fraught. What's the significance of places like the Rosenbach in our society?
That's a question that's close to my heart, being that I spend all my time in the humanities. I think, I think museums traditionally have gotten this reputation for being elitist. A lot of times, people who maybe live next door to a museum in a city may not actually have access to the museum or to the libraries, or may not feel as if it represents their interests. And in reality, museums are the archives of who we are as people and our journey. And I really don't think that any one person or group should be discarded or privileged over another. What I think that museums and libraries should do, and I think have been doing, is to sort of contextualize these stories. As you know, so many museums do not have the space to display everything they have in their holdings. And so I think having exhibitions that are sort of special exhibitions that sort of pinpoint a convergence of maybe what was happening in terms of a particular movement of thought, whether that was, and what's going on philosophically, politically, what was going on in industry, sort of gives a better, broader picture. And I think the Rosenbach does this, through the Behind the Bookcase tours and sort of making those connections. In fact, where we met was on that tea Behind the Bookcase tour, and you were pulling together the idea of tea as a expression of colonialism and how it was being perceived and written about. And that was a really wonderful moment to sort of look into the multiple narratives that were coming out of different people who were on different points of view. So I think understanding these different stories makes us more informed citizens of the world. I think it makes people understand a little bit better how relevant the stories that are being told can connect to them, even if they don't consider themselves very arty or of a museum type. The Rosenbach and all institutions of learnings, and I include here like schools, like my classroom, have the power to help citizens become better informed, see themselves in history, and feel empowered to be more active in their own sphere.
I love that assessment, and your last sentence there really captures what I feel to be our mission and the good that we have to bring to the world is in a time when there's a lot of social distrust and frankly a lack of easy access to empathic, empirically verified information, collecting institutions where we have these material artifacts from the past can really be a place where we build those social connections and build trust, build community, hopefully in a way that moves our world forward. So let's hope that we can continue doing that work in the future. Sheila, I want to thank you so much for sharing all of your insights today. I'm really excited to explore some of these books we've discussed, and I'm looking forward to seeing you around the Rosenbach again before too long.
Thank you so much, Alex, for inviting me. I've really enjoyed my time here in our discussion.
Thank you for listening to the Rosenbach Podcast. Check back soon for another glimpse into the Rosenbach's remarkable collection of rare books, manuscripts, art, and artifacts, and for more fascinating conversations about history, art, and culture. To learn more about the Rosenbach and to plan your visit to see treasures from the Rosenbach's collection, Literature of Great Britain and Ireland, visit rosenbach.org. We host a variety of on-site and online events and public programs, and we always welcome questions from listeners about how to use our collections. The Rosenbach's community reaches all around the globe, brought together by our love for history, rare books, manuscripts, and the arts. I hope you will consider supporting the Rosenbach and this podcast by becoming a member today. It's one of the best ways you can support our work. Memberships start at just $55 and give you access to everything we have to offer, online and in person. If you cannot make a financial contribution, please give our podcast a good rating on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to help us build our audience. The Rosenbach Podcast is supported by a generous grant from the Evelyn Toll Family Foundation. Thanks again, and I look forward to continuing our conversation about the Rosenbach's treasures on the next episode of the Rosenbach Podcast.
Chains and slavery. Oh, will be a traitor knave. Oh, will fill a cow's grave. Oh, say base as be a slave. Let him turn and flee. Oh, for Scotland's king and law, freedom's sword was strongly drawn. Freemen stand.